Welcome to the reading of Little Pear. This is video 5. In video 5, we'll be reading chapter 8. Just one chapter in this video, chapter 8. This book is a novel, a realistic fiction novel called Little Pear by Eleanor Frances Lattimore. Little Pear by Eleanor Frances Lattimore. We are on chapter 8. How Little Pear Went to the Fair is the title of chapter 8. And we will have Rowan today as our guest reader, reading the voice of Little Pear. So when you hear Little Pear talking, what's that face, Rowan? When you hear Little Pear talking, you'll know it's Rowan reading the voice of Little Pear. How Little Pear Went to the Fair. Chapter 8. The men in the village of Shagoo, where Little Pear and his family lived, were mostly farmers. All day they worked in the fields that lay on all sides of the village. Sometimes they would go to market fairs at neighboring villages to sell their grain and vegetables and to buy what they needed from other farmers. Little Pear's father was a farmer. One day in the summer, he came in from the fields very early. There is a fair today, he said, in the village of Woku. I'm going there to sell some of my onions and cabbages, and to buy some melons and sweet potatoes. I have heard that it is a very large fair, with many things to buy besides vegetables, so I shall bring a present to each of the children when I come home. Daggoo, Ergoo, and Little Pear all became very much excited. Daggoo loved pretty things to wear. I should like some silk flowers to put in my hair, she said. Ergoo liked bright-colored things to play with. I should like a lantern, she said, shaped like a fish or like a rabbit. Little Pear said nothing, because what he wanted most of all was to go to the fair himself. While the others were talking, he slipped out into the courtyard. The village of Woku was 3 miles away. Little Pear's father was going to walk there, pushing his wheelbarrow full of vegetables. The wheelbarrow stood in the courtyard, all ready and laden with the vegetables. What do you predict Little Pear is going to do?
He's going to sneak into the fair.
Do you think he's going to walk by himself?
Yes.
Okay, Rowan predicts that he's going to walk by himself and meet his father there and sneak into the fair. Let's see if Rowan's prediction is confirmed or denied. The wheelbarrow stood in the courtyard, already laden with, or heavy with, the onions and cabbages. Little Pear walked around the wheelbarrow, looking to see whether there was any space anywhere big enough for a small boy to squeeze into. And yes, there was one. Little Pear crawled in among the 4 cabbages and covered himself up as well as he could with some onions. Then he lay very still. When Little Pear's father started out in the direction of Woku, it seemed to him that his wheelbarrow was rather heavy. But he only thought, what a fine load of vegetables I have. He never guessed that Little Pear was hidden in the load. I believe part of Rowan's prediction that Little Pear is going to sneak into the fair seems to have been confirmed, but part was denied because instead of walking himself, Little Pear is hiding inside his father's wheelbarrow. Where is Little Pear? Asked Ergoo after she and Daggoo had watched their father out of sight.
He's inside.
That naughty boy, said Daggoo. He is always up to some mischief. I hope he hasn't run away, said his mother anxiously. But then she remembered that Little Pear had on his silver good luck chain. "He has probably just gone to play with Big Head," she said, and went back to her work in the house. Dagu and Ergu went back to their work too. They sat on the doorstep sewing while the canary sang and hopped around in his cage above them. They were making shoes. Shoes of black cloth with soles made of layers and layers of white cloth stitched together firmly. As they embroidered flowers and butterflies on the toes of the black shoes and stitched the cloth soles, they thought of the fair and hoped their father would return soon. Meanwhile, their father was jogging along a rough country road with his wheelbarrow, and Little Pear was curled up tight among the cabbages and onions. He was lying very still, for he was afraid that if his father should discover him, he would send him home. Little Pear thought,
I shouldn't mind being spanked so very much, but I do want to see the fair.
So he doesn't even care if he gets in trouble and gets a spanking. He just wants to make sure he doesn't have to go home. Joggity, joggity, jog. The wheelbarrow went bumping along the rough road. Little Pear wanted to poke his head out to see the countryside as they passed, but he thought that he had better keep still. From where he lay, he could hear all sorts of strange sounds on all sides of him. There were donkey bells and the jingling of traveling tinkers. There were creaking cartwheels and grunting pigs, and every once in a while there was the nee-haw braying of a donkey. There were many footsteps and voices, loud and high, old and young. There were lots of people going to the fair,
Wait.
thought Little Pear.
It's my turn.
Oh, sorry,
There are lots of people going to the fair,
thought Little Pear. Joggity jog, joggity jog. Then suddenly the wheelbarrow stopped.
Is this the fair?
Little Pear wondered, and he peeped out very cautiously from under the onions with one black apple seed eye. Yes, they had reached the village of Woo-Coo. It looked just like Little Pear's own village, only it was more crowded than his had ever been, even during the New Year's festival. On every side there were people who had come to buy and sell. There were young men with round, smiling faces. There were old men with wrinkled foreheads and thin gray beards. There were farmers and merchantmen and fruit growers and men who sold pigs or sheep and men who sold birds. The fair was all along the main street of the village. Fruit and vegetables were arranged in tempting piles along both sides of the street. There were trays of candy, too. The thin, flat kind made of sesame seeds stuck together with syrup and cut into squares. The square, black kind that looked like charcoal. And best of all, tang hulers. There were men selling all sorts of things besides food. There were men with bundles that untied and spread out along the sides of the street. Some of these bundles were filled with porcelain dishes, and some were filled with beads. Some had small square chests in them with little drawers filled with curious things. Small people carved out of wood, and tiny silver fishes that wiggled as though they were alive. Little Pear saw everything as well as he could from his hiding place. He was peeping out with both eyes now, but nobody noticed him because everybody was too busy buying and selling. The middle of the street was thronged with people, all jostling each other, and each man calling out in a loud voice the name of the thing he was selling.
Perhaps I could climb out of this wheelbarrow without getting seen,
thought Little Pear. But just then there was a sudden disturbance. A man who had brought some pigs to sell was trying to pass a man with a flock of sheep. The sheep and the pigs were all getting mixed up, and the two men were angry and excited. Each one shouted out that it was the other one's fault, and the sheep bleated and the pigs grunted, and Little Pear, who was watching, suddenly began to laugh. "What's the matter with your onions?" asked a farmer who had stopped to buy from Little Pear's father. "Your onions have a voice, and they're laughing." Little Pear's father grew very angry. "Some bad boy has hidden himself under my wheelbarrow," he said, and he looked under the wheelbarrow, and there was no one there. "Look inside," suggested the farmer. So Little Pear's father lifted up the onions, and there was Little Pear. By this time, a crowd of people had gathered around the wheelbarrow, and they all laughed loudly when they saw what was inside. "Did he grow on your farm?" they asked Little Pear's father. They all stared at Little Pear, says the caption here. There's Little Pear in the vegetables, and there's all the people standing around.
Little Pear grew.
He did grow on the farm, just not as a plant. "You must have a remarkable farm." Then they all laughed again, and they all stared at Little Pear, who sat among the cabbages with his pigtails standing straight up in the air. Little Pear's father started to be angry, but when he saw everybody thought it was a joke, he laughed too. "This is not for sale," he said, patting Little Pear on the head, "but the rest is." The men were all in good humor now. They started to buy the cabbages and onions. Soon everything was sold, and Little Pear's father had an empty wheelbarrow and several strings of money. Perhaps it's a good thing that you came," he said to Little Pear. "Now I shall buy some sweet potatoes and some melons." When they returned home that evening, Little Pear rode in the wheelbarrow again, but this time he sat on top of the load instead of being hidden. In one hand he held a present for Daggoo, some beautiful silk flowers fastened on long pins to put in her hair, and in his other hand was the present for Ergu, a lovely green lantern shaped like a rabbit. And as for Little Pear, well, he had a trip to the fair. And that's the end of chapter 8.
The last
Video 5 of the book of Little Pear, and I hope that you have enjoyed this reading and that you'll come back for video 6 to hear chapter 9 in our book.